I need to recover from this speech about Germany's lackluster performance. So I think it's a good recipe to start talking about Russia instead, don't you think? And I'm waiting for my panelists to show up. Here they come.
Good to see you.
Hey,
Ambassador.
Great of you to do this.
So,
I think we need to do this in kind of sprint mode because we lost a little bit of time in terms of sticking to the schedule. So I'll do the introduction in shorthand. I'll start with Karlijn, who is working at the British Embassy in The Hague, an expert on defense, and we're so delighted to have you here with us. I then go to my good old friend, Ben Hodges, who was willing at extremely short notice to join us here this afternoon because Senator Murphy wasn't able to do this in addition to his earlier performance. So thank you, General, for joining us. Most of you will be aware that General Hodges was the commanding general of the U.S. Army in Europe and is one of the most experienced U.S. Army officers with huge knowledge about the European and the Russian situation. And last not least, my good friend Edgars Rinkēvičs, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Latvia. He has been Minister of Foreign Affairs for I don't know how many dozens of years, for a long time. He served also in his Defense Department. Again, I'm delighted. We just recently met in Berlin. Edgars, it's great to have you. Our subject this afternoon is Russia. I want each one of you to at least spend just a few brief minutes telling me what you think about it. And just by framing the discussion, let me say, why is it that Russia, if we leave aside China for the moment, that Russia continues to be our most serious challenge if the GDP of Russia is about the size of the GDP, without offense, less than Italy, a little bit bigger than that of Spain? Why are we continuing to worry so much about Russia? And then, of course, the next question is, when we look at the decisions we've taken since the illegal annexation of Crimea, etc., is this policy that we have engaged in, sanctions, containment, if you wish, military reinforcement, is that promising to deliver the kinds of results we want? Are we missing something? Is this a successful approach to Russia? And my last question, and I could add 10 or 15 more questions to this. By doing what we're doing, are we actually driving Russia into the arms of China and producing an effect that is not an effect that we can like? So, who would like to start? Let's start with an active foreign minister. Edgars, you start.
I was just thinking that I'll be happy to be the last one and everyone else speaks, but trying to be very telegraphic and trying to cover all 3 points you just raised. First of all, why we should care about Russia compared with other countries with larger GDPs? Because the recent history has shown that this country has been able to violate international law and order and to create a lot of chaos that we are not able actually to contain. Second, about our current state of play when it comes to strategy and tactics. I do believe that our approach was right. Well, back in 2014, and Ambassador, you are quite right, I'm the foreign minister for 7.5 years. I have seen better times, and I have seen 2014. Back in 2014, I would be saying that we are lacking stricter measures than we are actually imposing. Now I would say that the approach was right because we are remarkably united. We were able to stop the deterioration of situation, but we are now trying to figure out how to solve the situation. The final point about China, well, frankly, I don't buy this argument that we are kind of driving Russia in hands of China. Believe me, Russians themselves are quite scared about the growing role of China, especially when it comes to their region. So I do believe that there comes the point where they will have to choose if they are forming more civilized alliance with us and behaving by international rules and to some extent balance what is the policy of China, or they become very much dependent on China. That's my take in a telegraphic way on 3 points.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me push you on just one point a little bit. Vice President Pence and others, of course, have included references to the INF treaty and the future of arms control. How worried are you, or are you worried about a future where we will not have meaningful attempts at arms control with Russia? How serious a problem is that for you? 30 seconds.
It is a serious problem, but the German journalists just before this panel asked me the same question, how scared I am or how worried I am. My answer was, frankly, the treaty was violated before. And Iskanders were in Kaliningrad Oblast before the formal withdrawal. So from the practical point of view, there is no change. What we must do, we can't revive the dead arms control regime, but we must work hard to create the new one. And here I'm very much with the German foreign minister who is advocating the new arms control, let's say, talks. But I also understand it will take decades probably before we get there, but it is the must for us to do.
Okay, thank you very much. Karlijn, let's go to you, and let's hear your take on these questions and issues that we're discussing this afternoon.
Yes, before I start, I would like to stress I'm speaking in personal capacity. So
Of
I
course.
will also share a little bit of a personal story.
So this is not Theresa May's official
No.
position?
No.
Okay, fine.
I had a chance 2 days ago to go to the National Archives to see the Washington Treaty opened at Article 5. And it was flanked with a black and white picture of the leaders signing it. And it seemed like a treaty from my grandparents' generation. And, you know, I'm a post-Cold War kid from Western Europe. I grew up not knowing two Germanys, just one. And a threat, or even the concept of a threat, was something I only saw perhaps on TV, on newsreels. So I think that's important to stress that my generation has perhaps a different relation to NATO and the treaty. And to come to your question about the threat from Russia, the threat perception for my generation, and I'm speaking also from a Dutch perspective, changed definitely with the annexation from Crimea and the shoot down of MH17, which had a lot of Dutch victims. And therefore, this session is titled Deterrence and Dialogue. And I would like to stress that latter point of the dialogue. And I think 2 points. The dialogue part is with Russia, through official channels, using the NATO-Russia Council, for example, but also utilizing EU-NATO cooperation, making sure it's not only on the military side, but also on the wider economic and political and diplomatic channels. And the second point I would like to make is the dialogue with our own citizens, and the dialogue NATO as an institution has to have, and showing what the relevance of NATO in that regard is, but also making sure that it's clear to citizens that NATO is not just an institution, but it's about the member states and the citizens in it, and regular citizens from my generation and the generation after, knowing what the relevance of that is.
Thank you, Karlijn. That's great. Let me turn to General Hodges. Isn't it amazing, General, how our world has changed? I mean, 5 or 6 years ago, we were preparing a volume celebrating, 50 years of the Munich Security Conference, and we decided to use as a title "Towards Mutual Security." This was in 2012 or 13, a year or so before the Maidan explosion, if I can call it that, and the Crimean annexation, etc. There were enormous hopes that we could move closer with Russia. So let me have your take as a former very important key military commander in Europe. Was it all only the Russians' fault? Should we stick to the NATO-Russia Founding Act, or should we throw it on the heap of history? Where should we take it? How should we take it forward? Please.
Ambassador, thank you. Let me say first, Germany is an essential ally for the United States. It's also essential for the United States' ability to execute its national defense strategy and national security strategy. Can Germany spend more? Sure, but I wish that we had also heard all the things that Germany is doing that are important for our collective security. The trust that the German people have shown in the United States for over 70 years, where we've had American soldiers, Air Force, living there, operating there, not to protect Germany, but as our contribution to collective security. And the access that Germany gives us now, flying in and out of Ramstein, seaport of Bremerhaven, the training that we do there, the intelligence sharing that we do with Germany, the ability to project power on the land and from the air into Africa and the Middle East, as well as deterring Russia. Those are also important parts of burden sharing. And the leadership that Germany has shown with the creation of headquarters at Rostock, 3 of the 9 cores of the NATO force structure. Germany is a framework nation. And I wish that more people were aware of those contributions, that it's not just how much spending there is. Germany also, I think, is the country that can help us the most in dealing with Russia. Russia respects German, in fact, the brand made in Germany is respected all around the world. Not everybody may love it, but they all respect it, whether we're talking about engineering, healthcare, education, obviously precision engineering, diplomacy, and somehow you figured out how to have an industrial power nation and yet increase the green space at the same time. So you figure that out. And so I think we would all be wise to look to Germany to continue doing what you are doing now. You're the lead in keeping EU sanctions in place on Russia. The Minsk agreement is German leadership all over it. So these are areas where I think Germany can play a critical role in helping us deter Russia. Now, the Black Sea region, I think that's the next strategic, that is the strategic arena where there's going to be the most competition. With Russia now, this is no longer just hybrid warfare or disinformation. This is actual force ramming Ukrainian Navy vessels. You've got these 24 sailors still sitting in jail in Moscow. Thousands of Ukrainian soldiers are being killed. I think if the West does not push back on what Russia has done in the Kerch Strait, and if we don't demand the release of those sailors, because they're there because Russia claims this was a violation of their territorial waters. Obviously, it's not Russian territorial waters. But if the West doesn't do something about it, then we have de facto acknowledged Russian sovereignty over Crimea. And this is where I think German diplomatic power, as well as economic power, could be very helpful in pushing back on this.
Thank you. Let me also ask you a question on arms control. As a military commander, what would be your advice if and when the INF treaty is gone, given the fact that Russia has already deployed, I mean, Iskanders and other nuclear-capable weapons? Would it be your recommendation that we come up with a response, including, like tit for tat, or do you think that is not necessary? As you know, there's a wide-ranging debate in Europe whether we should not do anything or come up with a strong response. What's your recommendation?
Well, I thought the Secretary General was very clear today that it's always going to be our responsibility to protect our populations, and of course the populations that are most affected by the Russian violation of the INF treaty are European populations, European citizens. And so the nations, we have got to do things to protect these populations, whether it's through cyber, through kinetic missile defense, very other means. So protecting our populations is number one. But number two, I think, again, diplomatic pressure on Russia, holding them accountable. And then finally, what Secretary Carter used to call a horizontal escalation, to present challenges to Russia in other places. I think just putting missiles in Latvia or Germany with technology today is not necessary, and I don't think that would necessarily be helpful.
Okay, great. Ladies and gentlemen, we have only a few minutes left, so I now look around. Who has a question to ask? If you have a question, try to make it a brief one. There is a question over there, please.
Thank you.
Thank you. Captain John Jacobs, Royal Netherlands Armed Forces. Back in February, there was rumor about possibly a new INF treaty, or at least Russia said they would be open for that. Would anyone in the panelists try to comment on that one? What's the stage of that? Is there going to be a new treaty? And if so, would it include more countries than just US and Russia?
Okay, any other question? We'll just collect 2 or 3 and then go back to the panel. Jim, wasn't there? Did you want to ask a question? No? No? There's a question. Yes, over there. The lady in the back row.
Could we have some comments about Russian troops entering Venezuela?
That's a good question. That will go to the general. And there is a question from my good friend. Please.
None of our panelists mentioned the act of terrorism committed in Salisbury. What should the response of the alliance be to incidents of that kind?
All right, shall we take it in the same order? Edgars,
Sure.
you're first.
Well, the first question, actually, what I heard from President Putin directing his defense and foreign ministers, that he specifically said no new negotiations on INF treaty. So I can't comment on any kind of rumors. But what I believe, we need to have such kind of arms control debate, but it must include all countries that have the capacity or capability to produce such kind of missiles. Second, on Venezuela, frankly, I would say the general would commend that from military point of view. But my take here is that this is quite an interesting Russian strategy, like with Syria, like with some other places. Create a small problem, and you get, like we get the ownership, they get the kind of say, and we don't know how to deal with that in coming months or even years. So I do believe that this is a little bit of also political trick. And on Salisbury, frankly, I would say that more efficient in my mind was European Union, together with some of key allies like United States, other countries apart from EU, because we were able to coordinate our action on sanctions, and we were able also to coordinate expulsions of many of Russian spies. So not necessarily we need the alliance to act sometimes. Sometimes it's better to use other organizations, other instruments, and I believe we were quite successful, providing very strong response that probably was not anticipated in Moscow when the Salisbury incident was actually planned and initiated.
Karlijn,
Yes,
your
I
take.
would like to add on to it, and I think it was a very good signal that there is such unity in a response in support of the United Kingdom in Salisbury. And I think also the strong point about that is the ability for attribution, and that also goes for the OPCW hack that was announced or was publicized after that, related to Russia. Something that I think needs a little bit more work in the NATO sphere is how to respond to these hybrid threats that are below Article 5, and how do you make sure that it's a coordinated response on a political and diplomatic level, but also indeed on economic level. And I think Salisbury was a positive example of that there is ability for EU member states, but also in cooperation with NATO to do that.
Ben, you have the last word.
So I also am not aware of a new INF treaty, but if there is going to be something, I agree with the ambassador or minister. There has to be. It can't just be U.S. And Russia. I mean, so many nations have capabilities now that exceed the original treaty limitations, that it would have to be broader. And as President Reagan said, you know, trust but verify. There's no point in having a treaty if you don't have a serious, meaningful compliance protocol. As to Venezuela, why would we be surprised, or why should anybody be surprised that Russia, the same country, the same government that sided with the Assad regime and weaponized uncontrolled migration by putting millions of Syrian refugees on the road to Europe, in effect, that they would also side with a government that at least 50 other nations in the world have said the Maduro government is no longer the legitimate government. So nobody should be surprised that, that the Russian government has sided with them. And I think this is a good example of where strong, unified diplomatic pressure is called for. It was my omission, not an act of commission, to fail to mention Salisbury. I was astounded how fast the nations responded and how quickly diplomats were withdrawn. I don't know if I've ever seen something like that on that scale and with that speed. And that really goes to the Secretary General's last phrase today: America needs friends. My colleague at SEPA, where I work, Edward Lucas, he says, you know, allies can be annoying sometimes, they irritate you, but you know, they bring, even if they don't bring a lot of tanks, they bring diplomatic power. And each nation has a voice inside the UN, inside the EU, inside various other institutions that can bring pressure. And so I think my country would benefit from helping build cohesive, coherent diplomatic efforts and economic efforts as well.
I am enormously pleased each time I hear a military officer speak in positive terms about diplomats. So thank you very much, Ben, for
I'm done for the month, by the way.
For that remark. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm receiving frantic messages from our organizers that my time has run out. I apologize to those who wanted to ask additional questions. I know we could only cover a very few aspects of the huge problem of Russia. Let's give our panelists a hand. Thank you very much.